Gratitude is the realization that the element that is appreciated has a relationship to the greater good. In the case of the soul, this relationship is the greatest good for the self. In this moment of gratefulness, the volitional spirit is passive, letting the sentient quality of the soul take on its activity of being aware of its relation to the greater self, meaning how that appreciated object is relating to the larger picture of the soul, and how that object is relating to the greater world. That object's value is thus increased by understanding its larger connection, revealing other objects. This appreciation of the object has greater value than just its small finite form. The value of that object is extended by its relationship to the soul's destiny. The object's relation to the greater world thus offers one of the possible paths that could be acted upon, if not just simply appreciated for its potential role. The gratitude of that object thus is the pleasure we experience in understanding how that object connects to our destiny. The pleasure of gratitude blossoms with connectivity that is developing in the moment. It is not a willful act, but an act of surrendering of volition, letting the soul guide the sentient experience of the path of making those connections. The soul in this case takes on its activity where the volition is acted upon and is spoken to by the soul's interest in itself. It is a surrender of volition to the larger self, the soul. Just as the center point in a sphere no longer becomes the point of focus, the circumference of the sphere thus takes on its activity to the object at the center, through the radius. The object here, thus, is the radius. So the volition experiences this object as the radius leading the volitional back to the soulful self. And the self experiences the circumference of the soul as a great sentient pleasure in making this connection with itself between the point and the circumference, making this connection to its larger, true, trustworthy self. An example of this could be, for instance, a meaningful object that had been lost, and unable to find it for a long period of time. Giving up and looking for this meaningful object, which could be anything from a stone, a job, a project, an idea, a plan, etc. After some time, part of that object would begin to slowly return before completely manifesting itself again, revealing that the meaning of this object now has a soulful connection to the greater self. Whereas previously the connection to the soul was tentative, in that the volition had attempted to connect to its own soul. In other words, the volition was trying to act in its own best interest. By letting go of the finite relation the volition had with this object, the infinite nature of space as the soul reconfigures itself through time to put into motion so that the object connects eventually in a meaningful way to its greater self. The object becomes the radius. And when the reconfiguration is complete, part of the object begins to make its return in the sentient experience of the volitional self. So, for example, if the object is a stone, take a simple example, the part of the stone that will slowly manifest is the meaning it previously had for the self, such as the value of the stone as being a gift from somebody, or it had represented an emotion, or had maybe even been used as a talisman of sorts. So those parts of the stones, such as the person who had been giving the gift, or the emotion it had represented, or the intention of the talisman, would actually begin to re-enter the experience of the person before the actual reappearance of the object, thus creating a synchronicity, thus having an experience of the soul, or having a soulful experience, as synchronicities tend to be. And so when the soul's connection is complete to the volition through the object, it is at that moment the lost stone appears in being found again. The stone finds its way back to you through your own soul. And so the stone, in this case, takes on a more meaningful value of being soulful. So too in the case, let's say, of a job or a project or an idea to develop or a plan, the particularly intense intention of the volition that was invested in trying to act in its own best interest, and when the project or job or an idea or plan is let go of after the investment or effort through that volitional investment are no longer providing to be the highest interest. In other words, we give up an idea or give up a path. And this is a particular case where there is significant investments that were made. The soul reconfigures itself to complete the connection by eventually responding to the original efforts of volition, by creating a soulful connection to parts of those objects, because here we're not talking only about a stone, but something more complex like a project or an idea. And so those complex objects like a project or an idea or a plan, parts of it were more focused on than others, and so the soul connects itself to the best parts of those complex objects. So it reconfigures itself to complete the connection by eventually responding to the original effort of volition by creating a soulful connection to those parts of the object, which will eventually reappear in a more meaningful way and with synchronicities, so that there would be parts of that object. So when the soul is completing its connectivity through that particular previous investment, the people that might have been involved in the project or the plan would appear before a new and improved version of that plan or project would appear, and thus creating a synchronicity, and thus feeling like, as synchronicities go, that you're being spoken to by a higher power. But in this particular case, that higher power is just your larger, greater self. It is your soul speaking to you. This is a more meaningful way in this. The project is a more meaningful way in the sense that this new version of the object is now enthused with the connectivity to your own destiny, to one's own destiny. So that job now that is thought about, or the synchronicities that are occurring, is leading to the experience of, hey, that's strange. I was just thinking about that, or I was thinking about a part of it, and it just happened. So let's say you're thinking about somebody you hadn't thought about in a year or two, and that person 1 minute later calls you, or calls you 5 seconds later, and you had not thought about that person in a very long time. And then that person mentions something about a plan or a project that you had also just been thinking about for a week, which either that person was connected to it, but then so this series of synchronicities is that soul's connection to yourself through those objects that you had invested in. And so those sets of events in one's experience will prelude the eventual return of the objects that had been invested in, or parts of the objects that had been invested in, or the people that had been invested in a soulful, meaningful connection. This could also happen, let's say, in having a dream as a premonition. It's actually important to note that actually the soul does this naturally without the investment of volition. Sometimes the soul will manifest events in a series of synchronicities simply to connect with its own volitional self, or to awaken the volitional self, to awaken one's own spirit. This is not exactly the same as the volitional self having already made an investment of efforts, of intense efforts, let's say, into an idea or objects that is then replied to the soul. So whenever the volition makes an intense investment or a very enthused enthusiastic investment or tries to complete something and that completion doesn't occur, and that was actually a constructive attempt, right? Not a destructive, but a constructive one where you tried to actually complete something positive. The soul does respond to it. So when the infinitely small volition acts onto the finite world, to sum it up, when the infinitely small volition acts onto the finite world, into the cosmos, into our experience, the infinitely large sentient soul reacts by saying to its volitional self, "Oh, you want to meet me there? Okay, I'm on my way." So it is, and it's not as though the self is actually divided in two separate parts. It's that the self is infinitely small and it is infinitely large at the same time. It's just the activity can occur in one of the two places or in between. So when the infinitely small is active, this is when we make decisions, choices. It's coming from within. We're feeling it within our bodies. When it is the soul that is making that is the activity, and when the volition is more or less passive, you're receiving experiences which would be, in a conventional way, would be considered illogical. So you could have also premonitions, or you could have manifestations, or you could have out-of-body experiences. And also the radius, right? The middle ground would be the activity can occur there where the object, either that was invested by the soul or invested by the self, could take on the role of the activity, which would then just simply connect the self, the volitional self, with the soul. So, in a way, it is a meeting at a specific objects that would actually take on activity. Is simply a desire and a meeting at a specific time and location between infinity and eternity in the finite cosmos. It is the infinite spirit that is longing for the eternal self.